Thank you very much, and good evening. Welcome. Thanks for coming. And I'll talk to you a little bit tonight about mammoths on the Channel Islands. And as Bryson mentioned, there have been some recent finds on Santa Rosa Island. And some of the people who did the excavating are actually standing at the back of the room there. They can raise their hands there and identify themselves. That's Monica Bugbee and Justin Wilkins from the Mammoth Hot Springs site in South Dakota. And if you're ever cruising around in the northern Great Plains and you happen to pass through Hot Springs, South Dakota on your way to the Black Hills or Mount Rushmore or something like, or Sturgis for a motorcycle rally, be sure to stop in at Hot Springs and go visit the museum there, where they've actually constructed a museum over a mammoth dig site. So how's that for a dedication to the study of mammoths? So anyway, we're happy to have some of the esteemed mammoth paleontologists in the audience tonight. And without further ado, I'll let them go ahead and give the talk that I was going to give. Just kidding. Anyway, I'm happy to be here. It's always great to talk about the Channel Islands and to an audience that is a local audience here that knows the Channel Islands and loves them and appreciates them, and that's a wonderful thing. Other places where I talk about it, they ask me where the Channel Islands are, except in places like the UK, where they say they're not in California, they're off the coast of Britain. So that's different Channel Islands. First of all, can everyone hear me all right? Okay. And back in the control room there, is there any possibility of extinguishing this light or dimming it at least or something? Or maybe I can go get my sunglasses. Whoa. It's very bright. Yeah. There we go. I'm back. Okay, is that okay? All right. Mammoths on the Channel Islands, how and when did they get there? We'll talk a little bit about both of those things. And we'll even talk a little bit about why they're not there now. And that is very controversial. And we'll just jump right into the controversy when we get to that point. One thing that I wanted to be sure to say here is that our studies on the Channel Islands of mammoths and indeed all of the geologic studies that we've done on the Channel Islands have been a group effort. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, but we also work closely, of course, with the National Park Service, where these islands that we've been finding the mammoths on are located, and also the Nature Conservancy for parts of Santa Cruz Island. The Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County has been very helpful to us in a lot of our paleontological studies with our smaller fossils, marine invertebrates, and things like that. And then I mentioned the Mammoth site in South Dakota, and they have the coolest logo of all. They are represented by people who I introduced you to already, and they have had in their past for a long time people involved in research out here on the Channel Islands, particularly the late Dr. Larry Agenbrod, who some of you might know. He made frequent visits to California. He's a retired Northern Arizona University professor who then set up and dedicated his retirement years to the Mammoth site in South Dakota. And we miss him a lot, but we're trying to carry on his legacy with continued studies of mammoths. So mammoths in North America, during the last major glacial period, the last of the most recent of the ice ages, which was about 25,000 to about 12,000 years ago, we had two common species of mammoths in North America. One of them, let's go back. There we go. And the laser pointer is right up above here. You've got to pick it very carefully here because it's up above the left-right buttons. At any rate, the Columbian mammoth, or Mammuthus columbi, is indicated by these red dots where the sites are, where it's been found. Some of them ranged up pretty far north, but not very many. And most of our sites are down here in the western and southwestern United States, and a big concentration here in Florida as well. But the woolly mammoth, which a lot of people associate with the ice ages, is more of a northern species. We have a lot of sites here in Alaska and northwestern Canada, and then a lot of sites in the northern United States. Not so many sites in Canada, which you might expect to see, except for the fact that that's where the ice sheets were. So for a major part of the last glacial period, that was all covered by big, thick ice sheets. So a lot of that part of the world looked pretty much like the way Greenland does today. So that's why we don't have a lot of mammoth sites there, but we have lots of mammoth sites around it in the northern part. So those are our two most common species of mammoths in North America. But here in California and adjacent to the Channel Islands, we had a third species, Mammoth exilis, or the pygmy mammoth, which exilis meaning exiled to these islands, but not through some punishment, banishment, or something like that. They did this voluntarily, and I'll show you how in a little bit here. And one thing to note here is that the present distance from the closest mainland locality, which would be right around here near Oxnard, over to the closest Channel Island, which would be East Anacapa, is presently at about 20 kilometers. Okay, multiply that by 1.6, and that's how many miles you're talking about, 30-some miles, something on that order. Other way around, thank you. I was testing you just to see how awake you were. Very good. Anyway, as you can see, 20 kilometers, as I was saying. And keep that figure in mind, because we'll see how that changes when we go into the past. Thank you. 14 miles. So at any rate, mammoth remains have been found at a number of locations on 3 of the northern Channel Islands. A few of them on Santa Cruz, but only in the western part. And none of these have been found in place, as far as I know. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's correct. Lots of sites on Santa Rosa Island, and we'll see examples of those. And we have a few sites on San Miguel Island as well, and I'll show you some of those too. In fact, let's start with San Miguel Island. Here's some that are some of the first that I ever saw. This is a photograph I took in 1976. And these two people, Diana Johnson and Don Johnson, were two people that did a lot of work here in the 1960s on the Channel Islands. And how many people have seen the Caliche Forest on San Miguel Island or have heard of it? That was actually identified and named by Don Johnson, okay? And that's his wife, Diana, and they did this work early in the mid-60s, before many people were working on the Channel Islands. And Don managed to find a piece of cypress charcoal near this Mammoth Tusk. And that's been radiocarbon dated at around 18,800 years. And that puts us right smack in the middle of the last glacial period. Remember I said that was about 25,000 years to about 12,000 years or so ago? So that's really right in the middle of the last glacial period. And as you'll see when we get further on, a lot of our mammoth ages kind of fall into that time span, but not all of them. Here's some that were also done not too far away from where those last 2 sites are, near Running Springs and western San Miguel Island. But these were done just a couple of years ago by a couple of us with the US Geological Survey. This is one of my cohorts, Jeff Pagati, and he is pointing to some snails that are right near this tusk, which is hanging out here. And then in this gully up above, there's other fragments of other mammoth remains and more snails. And Jeff has been kind of a pioneer in trying to resurrect the capability of using snails for radiocarbon dating. For a long time, we thought that they weren't very good. It turns out some are not so good. But a lot of land snails, and those that live on San Miguel Island and Santa Rosa Island, are actually pretty good for radiocarbon dating. And see, these are the numbers we're getting from here, around 19,000. Again, pretty close to what we saw in that last picture. But here we've got some younger ones. So these mammoth remains apparently are a bit younger than these, which are lower in a stratigraphic sense from these others. So you can see we're spanning a lot more of the last glacial period here, just at this one particular site. Some of them are undated, but we keep finding them. One of the rangers, this is Luis Cuevas, who's the head ranger on Santa Rosa Island. She actually grew up on Santa Rosa Island, as a matter of fact. And she's pointing to this feature right here and a big pile of river gravel that's exposed in Betcher's Bay. And if we do a close-up, look at that. It's a mammoth tusk. Pretty beat up and weathering away rapidly. And I don't even know if it's still exposed there or not. Does anyone know? No. Randy's telling me it's gone now. Okay. But this kind of thing pops up every now and then, and we find them periodically. This is now retired Bill Faulkner from the Park Service here, serving as scale for the first complete pygmy mammoth skeleton, about 12,800 years old. And one of the excavators for this was Don Morris, who's a retired archaeologist for Channel Islands National Park, who is also in the audience here tonight and is going to keep me honest on mammoth history here, along with the two hot springs people. I got a lot of people checking on me here tonight, so I'm not going to make any more mistakes about metric conversions. I can assure you of that. At any rate, you can see this, a reproduction of this, cast of this, over in the Channel Islands Visitor Center, just right across the courtyard here on days when that's open. And I believe it's now in the Santa Barbara County Museum. Is that correct? The actual specimen itself. And phenomenal find. This is one of the few times where we've really been lucky here in California to be able to have someone discover this kind of a nearly complete skeleton. And it'll give you an idea of just sort of what the size of these pygmy mammoths are. They are significantly smaller. And we'll see another picture that will illustrate that very graphically. And here's our two superstars from Mammoth Hot Springs, South Dakota, or from the hot spring site in South Dakota. Monica and Justin, who you just saw a minute ago. Here they are when they're really doing their work. They're not standing upright and clean and showered and well-dressed and everything. This is what they usually look like. And here they are excavating this nearly complete skull, and it has a pair of tusks attached to it. There's one of them sticking out right there. This was done just literally in the last couple of weeks. And if you are a subscriber to the Ventura County Star, you probably read the stories about the discovery, and then there was a follow-up story about how it was airlifted out. And it's a spectacular find. And these two young superstars are going to be studying this and learning more about it. And we hope to find a lot more information about it. What we do know from a couple of preliminary radiocarbon ages, it is likely younger than about 13,250 years. So like the previous photo that I showed you, it's on the young side. We're still in the last glacial period, but we're really near the tail end of that, okay? And we're actually getting close to the time when we start to see the arrival of humans on the Channel Islands in those early days as well. And we'll return to that topic too. So, Mammoth Ancestry, and this is specifically Mammoth Ancestry for North America now that we're talking about. I mentioned the Columbian mammoth. Here it is right here. But it had an ancestor called Mammoth meridionalis, and this was probably an immigrant from Asia. We don't know, but we're pretty sure that's the case. But it's been around a long time. We have dates on this particular species of mammoth from Anza Borrego Desert State Park in San Diego County. Anybody been there? Yeah, a lot of people. Good. And there they go back to about 1.8 million years. Okay, so that takes us way back into the ice ages, into the earlier part of that ice age period that we call the Pleistocene. And that was apparently the ancestor of the Columbian mammoth, Mammuthus columbi, which we think probably evolved here in North America. And that in turn was the ancestor, we're pretty sure, of Mammuthus exilis, or the pygmy mammoth, which evolved on the Channel Islands themselves. And just to give you some size comparison, here's a scale in meters. So in feet, that would be, I'm not even going to try it. Not even going to try it. Anyway, you can see these were little guys. These were little. There you go. Thank you. So you can see they were pretty little. Okay, so these are the kinds of guys that you wouldn't mind, pet sitting for a while and in your backyard. They were probably just as cute in their day as the Channel Islands fox is cute in its current day. And so we would have loved to have seen them. But we'll do our best to use our imaginations instead. So They're on the Channel Islands. Columbian mammoths somehow got out to the Channel Islands and then through time evolved down to the smaller size. Why did they evolve down to a smaller size? Well, part of the reason is that, for one thing, there's no particular advantage to being large if you're out on an island where there aren't any predators that you have to worry about. You can be smaller and not have to appear fearsome to a potential predator. But probably more importantly, there's every good reason to get smaller because the little guys can find enough to eat when you've got limited areas like an island for food resources and things like that. The big guys might go hungry because there's maybe not quite as much to munch on out there. So through time, they tend to be selected down towards the smaller forms, smaller and smaller forms. We don't know how long that takes. We know that it happens commonly when animals migrate to islands and get isolated. There's a general rule in biogeography that if they're the size of a pig or larger, they tend to get smaller. Another good example from here in the United States are the key deer in Florida, which you can see if you go to Big Pine Key. If you just cruise around some of the back roads, eventually you'll run into them. My cohort Randy from the USGS, who's here in the front row, and I have seen these guys on Big Pine Key, and they are much, much smaller than the sort of deer that we're used to in Colorado, where we live. But at any rate, this is probably how the dwarfing process took place, is from limited resources on an island, every good reason to get smaller, and no good reason to stay large. But then the question becomes, how did they get out there in the first place? And we know that this was something that was an island process because we find both Columbian mammoths, but Pygmy mammoths as well on the Channel Islands, but no Pygmy mammoths on the mainland, okay? So that tells us that the Columbians came out, dwarfed down to the Pygmy sizes, and stayed there and were isolated. But we didn't have whether we had a reverse process or not, we don't know, but at least it wasn't enough for Pygmy mammoths to somehow get back on the mainland because we've never found any, okay? So it looks like an island process, but the question is, how did they get there? So for years and years, virtually all researchers appealed to former land bridges. And this is kind of like looking at old exploratory maps from the early European era of exploration when people thought that Baja California was an island and all kinds of crazy things. And there's a lot of imagination in these things. And what you're seeing here are some of the kinds of land bridges that were constructed by various researchers who studied these. But there's always a bridge, okay? There's always a bridge coming across here somewhere or another. Or a bridge like this, some of them really quite elaborate, as you can see here. A lot more electoral districts in the state of California in those days. But at any rate, some of these are ideas that go back into the 30s and 40s and 50s, but all the way up to the 70s as well. However, what's interesting is that there is no geological or geophysical evidence at all whatsoever that such land bridges ever existed. None, not a shred. Okay, and in addition, the fact that we find only Pygmy mammoths and not other mammals, if there were truly land bridges, and there were mammoths going across to the islands on them, why didn't the saber-toothed cats come along as well? Do you think they would just say, no way, man, that's going to be an island someday. I'm not going near that. Cats can swim, yeah, but we don't like it. They'd go right after it. Of course they would. And we'd see a lot of the other Ice Age mammals wandering across as well. Why only mammoths then on the islands? Okay, nobody could answer this question. And what's interesting is that the evidence for these land bridges, the only piece of evidence was just the presence of the Pygmy mammoths themselves. So people actually used that as the explanation that there had to be a land bridge. All the geologic and geophysical evidence to the contrary, forget about it, we're not going to worry about that. There had to be a land bridge because the Pygmy mammoths were there. Okay, well, as it turns out, no evidence for that, and there still isn't, and that's because it didn't happen. Now recall that we have this distance, which I will give in metric terms, 20 kilometers from Oxnard over to Anacapa. But to get to a real island, you're looking more at around 30 kilometers or so to get to eastern Santa Cruz. Recall, too, we haven't found any mammoths on Anacapa, but on the other hand, they're very tiny islands, very easily could have been eroded away. But the shallowest zone here, okay, the absolute shallowest zone is around 230 to 240 meters depth, okay? Let's keep that number in mind, okay? That's pretty deep water, even, you know, for a thing like the Pacific coast where we drop off fairly quickly. But that is as shallow as it gets, okay? However, things were different during ice ages, okay? Here's the world as we know it now in North America. The main ice sheet that we have that is in this part of the world is the Greenland Ice Sheet. What was left from a much larger ice sheet is now this little Barnes ice cap on Baffin Island up in Canada here. But that was once a large ice sheet here we call the Laurentide Ice Sheet. And this big thing that came all the way down here. Chicago was under ice, New York City was under ice, a lot of Minneapolis, a lot of our upper tier of states, large cities were all under ice. Virtually all of Canada, as you can see here. And here in the western part of North America, we had another ice sheet called the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. Wasn't as thick or as big as the Laurentide Ice Sheet, but still not trivial either. And so we've got a whole lot of ice here, and we had a larger Greenland, just for good measure. And our mountain ranges in Alaska had bigger glaciers. Plus over in Eurasia, we had the Fennoscandian Ice Sheet as well. Where did all that water come from? There's only one place it can come from, and that's from the oceans. So air masses that would come across and fall as snow here in the northern parts of Canada and farther to the east in the northern parts of Eurasia during a cold climate so that the snow would stay over through the summertime into the next winter. Kept building up, building up, building up, building up, building up, building up. And pretty soon you get to the point where a certain critical density is reached, can flow on its own weight, and you've got a glacier. You've got an ice sheet, okay? That's what we have right now in Greenland. And a little bitty one here, it's the Barnes Ice Cap, but which characterized the upper part of North America during the last ice age and in all previous ice ages, and there were more than 20 of them over the last 2.5 million years. So, if all of that moisture to build that ice sheet came from the oceans, what's going to happen to sea level? It's going to go down, okay? All right? So what we see then in a place like this part of the world is an enormous amount of land area that extends out from our present coastline, and you see it right here, going from the stunning metropolis where I grew up called Lompoc. It's actually a really nice town. Not a stunning metropolis, but it's a nice town. And at any rate, all of this white area that you see here is the land that would have been created around the mainland as sea level dropped and reached its maximum during the last glacial period about 20,000 years or so ago. Well, out here on the Channel Islands, look what happens. There's a lot of shallow shelf surrounding the islands, and all of that gets exposed as land, and all 4 islands get connected into one big island that was dubbed Santa Rosa by Phil Orr, who at that time was at the Santa Barbara County Museum. Now, depending on which sea level histories you look at, the actual area or the actual depth to which sea level dropped could have been as high as 95 meters or as low as 120 meters. It turns out it's not exactly the same on each coast because there's other factors involved, which I won't get into. But either way, you're looking at a significant increase in land area with all these islands being connected. So now, what's our distance to the former Ice Age Oxnard? 7.2 kilometers, okay? Not nearly as much. Still no land bridge, though. So how are they going to do it? This is the way they're going to do it. It turns out my undergrad advisor and master's advisor at the University of Illinois who was a native Californian and who worked on the Channel Islands, the one who named the caliche for us, was fascinated with mammoths, fascinated with biogeography, and was trying to address this question because he knew these land bridge theories were wrong. Couldn't possibly be true. He knew the geologic and geophysical evidence was against it. So he started looking through, this was back in the 60s now and early 70s, started looking through accounts of elephant behavior, modern Indian and Asian elephant behavior, and seeing what people had done, and they observed how they interacted with their environments and so on, and discovered there were a number of cases of elephants swimming, sometimes forced swims. For example, during an ocean-going ship having an accident at sea, and then an elephant getting loose, and then for its own survival, swimming to shore as much as 30 miles, by the way, which would be about 45 kilometers. So there. Okay, pretty good, huh? And so at any rate, that was a forced swim, but voluntary swims have been documented as well. And it turns out elephants are excellent swimmers, and both Indian ones and African elephants, and a lot of their relatives, like manatees, so they're closely related to, okay? And the Steller sea cow. Anybody heard of the Steller sea cow? They're not around anymore, but they were around not so long ago. And they certainly were swimmers and related vaguely to elephants. Am I correct? Yep, okay, good. I'm on track. And here's a good example right here. Rajan, the swimming elephant of Havelock Island, India. This poor guy had had some troubles earlier in life, as you can see, and had a lot of cruel activity placed on him, but has been adopted by the residents of this island. They take care of this guy, and every once in a while he goes out for a swim and does this voluntarily, has a great time, uses his trunk as a snorkel, and away he goes. So my old advisor documented this before Rajan was born, actually. The origin of the island mammoths and the quaternary land bridge history of the northern Channel Islands, California. He came up with the mechanism, finally explained why we had elephants, mammoths, that is, their cousins, out on the Channel Islands, but no other large mammals. And you don't need a land bridge to explain it. And he also added to this the evidence of why they went out there. He actually looked at some of the buried sand dunes that were cemented that had their dip angles, which tells us what the wind direction was, demonstrated that the winds were westerly, just as they are now. There's a lot of lush vegetation out there. That comes wafting across. These guys can smell this, and they say, hey, there's a lot of good eating out on those islands. Let's go swimming. And that's what they did. Okay? Now, what happens when you end an ice age, though? What happens to sea level? All that water goes back in the ocean. Sea level goes up, and all of a sudden they're stranded. Okay? And this is when we start to see some of the kind of dwarfing process sometimes take place. So what I'm going to show you here, this looks very complicated, but it's actually not. And it's easy to walk you through it. What this is basically a sea level curve for ice ages and interglacials that are in between them. We call the periods in between ice ages, like the one we're in now, interglacials. And this is time on this axis in thousands of years. So that's 100,000 years, 200,000 years, and back to about 450,000 years here. So every time you see a high point, we're in an interglacial, and sea level is high. Okay? And every time you see a low point, you're in a glacial period, and sea level is low. So this is essentially how the ocean is going up and down and up and down and up and down and up to our present level. So during the last glacial period, when all that ice was covering North America, we were in this low point right here. And you can see that last glacial period was one of the lowest of the lows of the last few 100,000 years. So it was a big glacial, let's say. And these different cycles here are given numbers. I've shown the interglacials in red, and those are called stages. So this is stage 1 that we're in. And so the last glacial period would have been stage 2, meaning the most recent of the glacial periods. So what we see from the photos I've shown you already are a lot of stage 2 aged mammoths. Okay? And we don't have any stage 1 age mammoths on the Channel Islands. We haven't found anything younger than about 12,800. Does that sound right? Okay. So we're really sort of at the tail end of stage 2 at that point. But we have these earlier glacials as well. And although they weren't maybe quite as dramatic as the last one, maybe this one was pretty close, they're still not insignificant. And they are still, we're still talking about fairly low sea level and land masses of the Channel Islands that would have been closer to that big land mass of North America. So we're going to take a look at this last part, last sort of glacial, interglacial, glacial cycle right here in a bit more detail. So we're just going to take that part of the curve and expand it out a little bit here. So here's the last interglacial. This was a period of time when sea level was actually higher than it is now. And we see evidence of this in places like the Florida Keys. Florida Keys are all coral reef material in their upper part. That is a coral reef that records a 6-meter higher level of sea compared to the present one. Same thing in Hawaii. The Waimanalo Formation is a coral reef limestone, and most of the city of Honolulu is built on it. Okay, so during the last interglacial, Honolulu and Key Largo would have been underwater, and so would Miami and St. Petersburg and Cape Canaveral, and yep, Disney World too. Okay, Disney World might be underwater pretty soon, I'm sorry to say. At any rate, so that's our last interglacial, and it was a whopper. The sea level was much higher, and it was much warmer than it is now, and we'll return to that theme too. Okay, and that's stage 5E. This whole period in here was our stage 5 in the last graph. We've actually subdivided it into 3 substages here. E, there's a D there, a C, a B there, and an A here. Clever, huh? It's scientists have learned the alphabet, okay? All right, and then we have an early last glacial, and then a little start of an interglacial that kind of fizzled, and then we go into stage 2, which is our big last glacial, and stage 1, our present interglacial. Well, most of our mammoth radiocarbon ages fall into stage 2. There's a few that are a little bit older, but at this point, when we get into 35 to 40,000 years, a lot of our radiocarbon ages are not necessarily reliable. Just a small amount of contamination can make what is an infinitely old age appear to be an age of about 30 to 40,000. So we have to treat those kind of cautiously, but it does indicate something older than the last glacial period, okay, or stage 2. But that's where our majority of our ages are. So the question is, well, gee, if we had all these earlier glacial periods, could there have been earlier migrations? And actually, good old Don Johnson hypothesized this as well. When he was describing the whole sequence of the last glacial migration by swimming, he said, possibly this scenario occurred several times during the late Pleistocene, meaning the ice ages. So this is something he recognized could have happened any time sea level was low enough that the distance was shortened between the islands and the mainland that it was within swimming length. Okay? So we always wondered about this. And we were always curious about it, and we were always thinking, gee, could we ever find some geologic evidence of earlier migrations? And actually, there was a clue that was given by Phil Orr, the guy who named Santa Rosa for that Ice Age mega island, in 1960. And he was talking about Santa Rosa Island, and he was talking about one of the uplifted marine benches that marks a high sea level stand. Now, it's not like Hawaii, like Honolulu or Key Largo, where the land is not going up. Here in California, the land is in many places slowly uplifting, and the Channel Islands are among those. So when we get a marine bench during an interglacial high sea stand, with time it gets lifted out of the water a little bit. And if you've ever driven along most of California Highway 1 from here all the way up to San Simeon, you're driving on that last interglacial bench that's been uplifted out of the water. Okay, how about that? So, anyway, what he said was, he was describing some of these marine deposits in one of these terraces. In general, a light gray calcareous clay containing fossil bones of whale, sea lion, sea otter, shorebirds, and occasional dwarf mammoth. Whoa, that means You're talking about a dwarf mammoth that has got to be beyond radiocarbon age and is all the way back into some part of the last interglacial complex, because that's the age of the deposit he's describing. Okay? So we thought, well, let's go look at these sorts of deposits and see what we can find. Are there occasional dwarf mammoth fossils there? So we were doing the mapping of marine terraces on Santa Rosa Island over the last few years. These brown areas that you see here are some of the old ones. These go back sometimes millions of years, not many millions, but a couple millions of years. But around here, this whole light, more yellowish color is the complex of one or two terraces that represent those stage 5 high sea stands. Remember 5E, 5C, 5A, those in that, excuse me, those in that time period are all along the shore there on Santa Rosa. This is what they look like. It looks like just a sort of a flat bench, a mesa-like one. The upper higher mesa that you see here is an older marine terrace or terraces. But in this canyon are exposures of what you'll see is a wave-cut bench, and it's got fossils on top of it, the seashells in there that date to the last interglacial. And they're the same species that we find living on the modern coast today. Okay? It hasn't been that much time that they've changed or evolved that much, but this is what they look like. So what we do is we scour exposures in canyons like these and along sea cliffs like these to see what we can find in there. And we were doing this, collecting these for fossils to try to date these. And they, once you get in the canyons, they look something like this. This is one of those wave-cut benches right along and through here that I've outlined. This is shale, which is millions of years old. And you can see there's an old sea cliff that's been cut, and there's a wave-cut bench that's been cut. And this is a wave-cut bench of a higher terrace. And then there's been river deposits from this canyon that has buried all of this. But right along here, I want you to trace that along that wave-cut bench. That's from the 80,000-year-old terrace and all the way out to this sea stack out here. We're going to go out there. And this is what it looks like when you look close up. There's that shale again. This is at a nice low tide. This is the Rincon Formation, this shale, millions of years old. But look what we've got here. We've got a wave-cut bench, and there's a layer of boulders that are the sort of boulders that you find sitting on the beach over in here or along here today. They have little holes that have been bored by rock mooring clams. There's fossils in there, sea otter remains, and we're going to look right here, and guess what we found? A tusk. How about that? There it is. There's a tusk. And I sent a photograph of this to Larry Agenbrod, because I'd been sending him photographs for years saying, I think I found a tusk. I think I found a tusk. And I'd send him a picture and he'd say, that's a whale rib, Dan. And, or he'd say, that's a large root cast, Dan. And there are all kinds of things that I misidentified in my enthusiasm. But this time he wrote back right away and he said, you've finally done it. You found a pygmy mammoth. So there it is, okay? So here's our Rincon shale, really old. That's the bedrock. Its wave-cut bench is this boundary right through here. And within this deposit, one of our cohorts at the LA County Museum, Lindsay Groves, found these limpets and other marine gastropods, or snails, if you will. So we know that's marine material. And Howell Thomas, his vertebrate paleontology sidekick, also at the LA County Museum, found enough fragments he was able to actually identify this as a sea otter, these bone fragments, and it could even take it down to the species. Okay? Now, it's easy to get terrestrial fossils mixed into marine fossils, because all you got to do is erode them out into the ocean. Okay? So on a sea cliff, all you got to do is have a mammoth who's walking along the top near the cliff, slips or dies naturally, or something falls into the surf zone. Everything gets eroded together in with these marine fossils, and this can happen. It's tougher for marine fossils to get up onto the land because they have to defy gravity to do that. Okay, and not too many of them do that. They, celebrated jumping snails of Ventura County have never been verified. So at any rate, so we know that this is a bona fide marine deposit, and this is a mammoth tusk that was washed into it. Now, what's interesting about this, when you look at the dimensions of this thing, this puts it sort of into the range of either a pygmy mammoth or, truth be told, it could be an immature Columbian mammoth. We really don't know for sure, but it's one of those two. There's no question it's a mammoth tusk for sure within these marine deposits. So I should say this is probably a pygmy mammoth. But at any rate, when could mammoths have migrated to the Channel Islands? This marine deposit it was found in is right here. So it's within stage 5, and that's 5E, C, A. This is 80,000 years old, okay? All right? Now, because it's 80,000 years old, or in a deposit that's 80,000 years old, that means it's at least 80,000 years, because it had to exist before that marine deposit was created. It could be right at 80,000 years, close to it, but it can't be any younger, okay? So you can't have that sort of a situation in geology, or you're violating the rules of geology, and no one wants to do that. So we know it has to be at least 80,000 years old, but could be older. Well, when did it, or it's more likely its ancestors, migrate over to the Channel Islands? Well, if you look at stage 5B here, sea level wasn't really much lower than it was during these high sea stands. 5C was not very low. 5D wasn't very low. And we know 5E, well, that's when Hawaii and Key Largo and Miami and all those places were underwater. So sea level was much higher, right? So you're talking about swimming distances that are comparable to what we have now, or were even greater, okay? So when's the most likely time? How about stage 6, okay? How about stage 8? How about stage 10? Any of those glacial periods are candidates. So we know then that mammoths migrated to the Channel Islands sometime before the last one during stage 2. So we know there had to be at least 2 migrations, okay? At least 2. Maybe more. We don't know. Okay, so how does that play out? Well, if you look at a cross-section of Santa Barbara Channel, the mainland, and the islands out here, and these are those marine terraces that I showed you the picture of on Santa Rosa, these wave-cut benches, okay? They've been forming for the last 2.5 million years on the California coast as we've had glacial, interglacial cycles. And we had a high stand of sea, and then sea level drops during the glacial period, and the land uplifts, and the terrace gets drawn out of the water. Well, this is going on the islands, and it's going on the mainland. So the channel distance here used to be greater in the past before all this uplift took place. And then through time, it's been shrinking. So maybe eventually we will get that land bridge. Who knows, okay? You got to, bring it up to 240 meters depth, so that's maybe not going to happen for a while yet. At any rate, there was a time probably when this distance was actually beyond the range where mammoths could swim, just too far. And maybe even during the next low stand of sea or glacial period, it might have still been too far. At some point, and we don't know whether it was stage 10, stage 8, stage 6, or even sometime earlier, but at some point, sea level got to the point where it was low enough and uplift had taken place on the land and on the islands to a sufficient extent that this distance was short enough that they're finally close enough they can swim across. And then when we get to the last glacial period, which was this whopper, okay, sea level really dropped, and enough uplift had taken place, the channel was down to that short distance of 7 kilometers or so, and easier to swim than even before, and away they went, and that's where we see a lot of our mammoths that date from the last glacial period, both Columbians and pygmies. Now, we don't know whether those pygmies evolved during the course of the last glacial period or from the earlier migration. We just don't know. So this is something that Monica and Justin will tell us about when they get all done with their studies, right? Yeah, that's right. That's the spirit. That's that can-do spirit in the mammoth community. But here's another question. Why did they become extinct? And there is probably no subject in Pleistocene paleontology more controversial than how the large mammals of North America, and Eurasia, and Australia, and a lot of other places became extinct at the end of the ice ages. And it's variable. Some became extinct sooner than others. And it turns out, actually, some of them nearly escaped. There were mammoths on place called Wrangle Island off the northern coast of Siberia that existed there until 3,500 years ago. Isn't that amazing? They almost made it. Almost made it. So when the pyramids were built, there were still mammoths on the earth. Isn't that amazing to think about? So I feel sorry for those guys. They almost made it, and not quite. Anyway, we know from the geologic record on the Channel Islands that mammoths became extinct on the Channel Islands somewhere around 12,000 years or so ago, and perhaps just a little older, something on that nature, okay, at the end of the last glacial period. There have been three major hypotheses that have been presented. One is impact from an extraterrestrial object, a comet or meteor, and this is an idea that has come into vogue just recently. There are a lot of people that have kind of gone along with this concept, and I'll talk a little bit more about it here in a second. A more favored hypothesis is climate change and sea level rise when we shifted from a glacial to an interglacial climate, so that conditions were warmer and there would be a loss of land area, so that Santa Rosa would start to break into individual islands. Okay, all of a sudden you've got less land area, less in the way of food resources, and so on. And this idea is favored by a lot of people. Here's another one that's favored by a lot of people, and that's the arrival of humans, because we're very close to the time when the first humans were arriving on the Channel Islands, okay? Within a couple hundred years, in fact, okay? Within our uncertainties with radiocarbon dating. So let's take a look at each one of these. That first one, this has been controversial, to say the least. Here's one of the groups that has come up with this. They came up with the idea that this large celestial body impacted on the surface of the Earth, brought about all kinds of things. Wildfires, ecosystem disruption, the creation of a cold period that's referred to as the Younger Dryas. This was a brief period. We know this did happen, this cold period. A brief period where we were moving out of the last glacial period, the last ice age, into the present interglacial, and then suddenly we had a precipitous drop in temperature globally, or much of the globe anyway, lasted for a full 1,000 years and was near glacial conditions. And there were glaciers that actually re-advanced in the mountains in Colorado, where I live. This has been verified, and we see it in a lot of geologic records. And this was also about the time that a lot of these large mammals became extinct. So these guys are saying that all of this was caused by this impact event. And they've accrued a lot of evidence that they present in support of this hypothesis. And then there are others that are the doubters to this theory. In fact, they've been rather blunt about this. They have assembled all the evidence against it and actually refer to this as a requiem. So you don't see this kind of terminology in a lot of scientific literature. Usually we try to be a little more restrained, and but this is amounting to saying, well, you guys are, full of it here. And but in truth, these guys have worked hard to try to come up with supportive evidence for this. These guys have also worked hard to evaluate that evidence. And quite honestly, my feeling is that these guys are probably more closer to the truth than these guys are. The jury's still out on this, but most of the evidence suggests that a lot of the evidence that these guys used is questionable or can be explained in other ways. So we're going to leave it at that. I'm not going to get into this one because it's quite a mess with the back and forth on that. But we're just going to say not likely. Not likely. Not no, but not likely. So climate change and sea level rise when we shifted from a glacial to an interglacial climate. That is possible. Here's one problem. Remember, we said that the mammoths had to come over at least twice, right? Once during the last glacial period, for sure, we know that. We see plenty of evidence of that. And at some favorable glacial period prior to that, sometime prior to 80,000 years ago. We don't know when. Could be stage 6, 150,000 years ago, stage 8, 250,000 years ago, some. We don't know when, but one of those periods when sea level was low. Remember, I said, too, that the last interglacial period, when sea level was higher, and would have been after that migration took place, whether it was at 250,000 years ago or 150,000 years ago, both of those are prior to the last interglacial when conditions were interglacial like 120,000 years ago. Okay, well, in a lot of places in California, Southern California, where these red dots are showing up here, we have records of not only a higher sea level and then uplift, but also the marine invertebrate fauna within that. All the snails and bivalves, or clams and other organisms that are in there, tell us that the waters around here were a lot warmer than they were during the current interglacial. So things were not, sea level is not only higher, but waters were warmer. Probably had more El Niños, probably had a lot of things that now live in Baja California or Central America migrating up into the Santa Barbara Channel. So conditions were a lot warmer. Furthermore, you even see it in fossil pollen that's recorded in a core that Jim Kennett at UCSB took right out here in the deepest part of the core that indicates that the vegetation tells us it was a much warmer climate as well. So if sea level was higher and conditions were warmer, then that means we actually had, this is the last interglacial shoreline right here along these islands where it's still preserved in not all the places, but you can see they're all inland because sea level was higher, right? So what does that mean about these island sizes? They're actually smaller than they are now, okay? The sea level was higher, all right? And the waters around here were warmer. And then what did we move into? The first part of the glacial period, right? And then we had a little, remember, a little failed interglacial period, and then we moved into the deep last glacial period. So mammoths then survived, came over during some glacial period, survived the warmest interglacial of the last 400,000 years, and then a glacial period that started, and then a half-started interglacial period, and then one of the coldest glacial periods, and then they moved into a rather modest interglacial, the one that we're in now, and then they decided that they had to die because they couldn't survive anymore? Doesn't make sense, because they survived an interglacial that was more intense than the present one, and where the land area was smaller than it was at the end of the last glacial period, and all the islands broke up again. So not only did the old Santa Rosa break up into islands, they were smaller islands than they are now. And somehow they did okay. They survived because we see them all the way to the last glacial period. That's the problem with the climate change hypothesis, okay? Not the idea that, the idea isn't that it's totally wrong or anything like that, but it's a problem with it, okay? Now, another possibility is the arrival of humans. That is also possible. And one of the things we've learned in studying mainland North America is that there are a number of places where there are bona fide mammoth kill sites, okay? Now, there are claims that there are a lot more of them, and some of them are equivocal. All the ones that you see here in the little black and white dingy colors are kind of supposed evidence of large mammal kill sites. But these are all ones that have been compiled by these two guys who are skeptics about the idea that humans were responsible for the demise of large mammals at the end of the last ice age. But even with their skepticism, they agree that there are some genuine sites where there's good archaeological and paleontological evidence that there were kill sites specifically for mammoths. So we know it's not a question then of saying, well, gee, humans couldn't have been responsible because we just can't believe they would kill mammoths. That's not true. We know that they did, okay? The evidence is there. What we haven't found is a kill site on the Channel Islands. No one has ever found one. There were claims to that effect back in the 60s, and those have all been debunked, okay? Turns out a lot of those were purported to be hearths and actually places where mammoths were barbecued by humans living on the islands at that time. And it turns out they are burn sites, but they are from naturally occurring fires, okay? So we can't count those. So it's true we do not have any bona fide kill sites on the Channel Islands as yet, but we do have them elsewhere, so this remains a possible hypothesis as well. But here's, I think, the one that I kind of favor, and that is, okay, we're not going to go with the impact idea. We're not going to go with climate change alone. We're not going to go maybe with arrival of humans, but keep open that possibility But how about climate change and the arrival of humans? Now that's a double whammy, okay? When you change climate, you diminish resources, and then you have these strange creatures arriving, all of a sudden you've got a totally different mix of variables in an animal's survival, okay? The jury's still out on actually on all 4 of these hypotheses. I don't have a strong feeling about any one of them. If you backed me into a corner with a gun and said you must commit to one or the other, I'd say I can't, okay? It's not really, we're not at that stage. But I'd put my money on this at this point, probably this combination. Anyway, so summary. Mammoth remains are found on the Channel Islands and most date to the last glacial period. They reached the islands by swimming during a glacial period when sea level lowered and the mainland to island distance was at a minimum, whether in English or metric units. It has been hypothesized that mammoths could have made the swim more than once prior to the last glacial period, and we recently found a mammoth tusk dating to 80,000 years that confirms that. Okay? This older age requires that pre-last glacial period migration. It was probably during an earlier glacial period. We don't know which one. But even during glacial periods, uplift has to bring the islands and mainland close enough for mammoth migration, and we don't know when that occurred. Mammoths survived a warmer last interglacial period, but climate change and the arrival of humans at the time of climate change may have brought about extinction of the mammoths. We don't know. That's still a hypothesis that needs more testing, but we'll see what the mammoth world tells us in the future. Thank you very much. Questions? Actually, Bryson here is going to give you a microphone so everyone can hear your question.
Quick recap. You were saying there's no geologic evidence for the land bridge, and was that primarily because of the depth of the water, and with the changing sea level, there's no way that
that's part of it, and also that's right. That's part of it, and some of it is just geologic evidence of matchup of rock types and things like that, and geophysical evidence, which I'm not an expert on, so I can't evaluate, but I take it from people I trust that there's good evidence against that and so on. So it turns out all the land bridge ideas were all constructed on the basis that because there were pygmy mammoths out there, they had to get out there by traversing land and not by swimming. So the land bridge idea never had any geologic evidence. All it had was paleontologic evidence. And it turns out we have another mechanism.
Okay, and I got one other quick question. So on the kill sites,
yes,
for the mammoths, so it was established that these areas where you identified the kill site truly showed that it was a human.
Yes.
You could show where there was cut marks or whatever on the remains. Right. So definitely human.
Yeah, and these two guys, particularly Dave Meltzer, who is a good friend of mine, teaches at Southern Methodist University. He's a very, very careful archaeologist and very cautious and conservative in how he interprets things. And his passion is the earliest arrival of humans in North America. And so he's aware that there have been throughout, the past few decades, but for a long time, claims of early human migrations to North America, going back 100,000 years, 200,000 years, just incredible claims. And he's been very skeptical about all this, and he's done a lot of the debunking of what were, in some cases, some pretty poor accumulations of evidence. So when you look at this and see those sites that he agrees are actually humans, you're looking at one of the most critical eyes. He's actually looking to eliminate sites. And these are ones that he agrees. Those are genuine kill sites. So there's about a dozen of them. There might be more by now. Justin and Monica, do you know? More mastodon sites, yeah. I didn't put the mastodon sites up there. At the time they wrote this paper, there were at least 2 mastodon sites. And I think it sounds like there may be more than that now. Yes, that's right. But I wanted to keep it to the mammoths, and so that was the reason for that.
Yeah, Dr. Muhs, isn't there, is it on? Yeah.
Yep.
Was there not evidence that both Colombians and pygmies were coexisting there for a later
Yes.
period?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. I was hoping someone would ask that, and I should have mentioned it. Yes, based on the radiocarbon ages that actually Larry Agenbrod had gotten for a number of the sites on Santa Rosa Island, there's good evidence that we had both Columbian and Pygmy mammoths out there at the same time, at least roughly at the same time, within a couple thousand years, or what our radiocarbon dating allows us to try to delimit. Now, the site that Justin and Monica have worked on here has some interesting characteristics about it with regard to this issue. Now, the idea is, of course, that if you have the islands here, the mainland here, the Columbians swim out, they land on the islands, the big guys start dwarfing, evolving down to little ones. You get a small population, okay? And if you have further migrations before sea level rises, then you could have Columbians and mammoths coexisting. Or if you had 2 migrations or more, you could have Columbians migrating out, they all dwarf down to pygmies, and then during the next glacial period, they migrate out again, and you've got pygmies and Columbians together. Now, the fact that we see pygmies and Columbians together during the last glacial period doesn't mean that all the dwarfing took place just during the last glacial period, but doesn't exclude that possibility. So it's possible that some of the pygmy remains that we found out there that are from the last glacial period are actually the descendants of earlier migrations. And then the Columbians are the recent arrivals, but then some of them could have also dwarfed quickly. We don't know how quickly the dwarfing process takes place. One of the things that Don Johnson hypothesized was that if they did evolve from Columbians to pygmies over an extended period of time, or even rapidly, there should be some geologic evidence of some intermediate-sized critters, right? Does that make sense? Because it doesn't happen instantly, So, Justin, do you want to make a comment about that? Or Monica, do you want to make a comment about that with your recent find? There you go. Okay. We don't know what that means yet, and these guys are going to study it. But what's interesting is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, this is one of the first bona fide finds where you could actually you have enough evidence that you could actually make some kind of a statement that it looks like it's kind of intermediate as a possibility. Right. Right. So, yeah. So here's the thing to do. These guys are going to be working on this skull that they found, this possibly intermediate-sized thing. And at the Santa Barbara County Museum, they'll be coming to California periodically. Most people would prefer to stay in South Dakota in the wintertime where they live. But we've managed to entice them into thinking of coming down here. And so they'll be doing things, and as I understand it, there might be in the future some exhibits at the Santa Barbara Museum where some of this work will be taking place. And so watch for notices from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And Cherry Carlson, who has been following the mammoth research with the Ventura County Star, might have an article about this every now and then in the VC Star. So keep your eyes open for that as well. She's become a real mammoth aficionado. So and she's been following all the work that everybody's been doing here very closely and done a good job reporting it. So if news comes up on this, she's going to tell you about it. So anyway, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Yeah,
we have time for one final question here tonight.
Okay. I think you're first. And
I'm first.
I'll tell you what. If
I have the mic.
Okay. All right. Who's first?
I'm back here in the back,
okay,
and I've got the mic.
Okay. I pretty much put you in the driver's seat.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
My question is, I've heard that the mammoths didn't do well when the islands were individual, as opposed to when it was Santa Rosa and there were more flat area. That mammoths as a whole just don't, they don't do well in mountainous terrain where there's a lot of topography.
Oh, well, actually what happens is these islands get more topography as time goes on. So in the past, they actually would have had less topography. They would have been flatter because they wouldn't have been uplifted as high. And so I don't think that would have been a limiting factor. quite honestly. What would have been more of a limiting factor is the shrinkage of those islands, for sure. Because you lose land, you lose the food resources that are on that land. That would be way more important. That's true. You have rougher terrain. Yeah, that's true enough. On the other hand, because most of these islands have been constructed by slow uplift of these marine terraces, which are by their nature flat features, you still would have had a fair amount of fairly flat terrain. It just would have been reduced in size. So the amount of area, I think, would have probably been more of a factor. Yeah.
There are some questions up front here. Would you like to answer?
I think this woman was first, and then right over here, this gentleman.
During the time that humans began inhabiting the islands, can you talk to us about maybe the number of mammoths that would have been on the islands at that time?
Oh my.
Do you know?
What do you guys think? Don, Justin, Monica? This is really hard to tell. Yeah. Yeah. I can give you a ballpark. Less than present-day Los Angeles. No doubt about that. I'll stake my reputation on that. Over here. Yes, sir.
I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was like 120,000 years ago. The water level was much higher
Yes,
than it is
that's
currently.
correct. Got it.
What was the cause for that rise?
This is near and dear to
It was
my heart.
before the Industrial Revolution, right?
Oh yeah. A few years before. Yes, we think there's been a lot of debate about this. 6 to 8 meters higher. You can do it with one Greenland, one West Antarctic ice sheet, plus part of Greenland, or all of the West Antarctic ice sheet and a bigger part of Greenland. All the other little ice caps and things like that we have now would not amount to much more than about a half a meter. The best evidence we have so far is that about 2/3 of Greenland went away during the last interglacial period. So that gives you about, let's say, 4 to 5 meters. To make up the rest, you had to get rid of all of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So the thinking is that it was probably most of Greenland and all of the West Antarctic ice sheet at that time. Now to get 6 to 8 meters. Yeah. Oh, no. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about meters in terms of measurements. No. Okay. Yeah. No. That whole cyclicity that you see there is due to changes in the Earth's geometric relationship with the sun and the amount of solar radiation that reaches the northern hemisphere in summer. Okay? Because remember we said that you build up a glacier in that part of the world by having conditions cool enough that the snow that falls in the wintertime stays over in the summer into the following winter. And when you keep repeating that again and again and again and again, you start to build up a glacier. One of the ways that you can do that is if you diminish the amount of solar radiation reaching that part of North America and Eurasia in the summertime due to changes in 3 things. One is whether the Earth's orbit around the sun is more elliptical or more circular. That has a 100,000-year cycle. Whether you have a precession of the equinoxes, because they do precess the way a top does, so that at times we have, like right now, our northern hemisphere winters occur when we are closest to the sun, but we're tilted away from it, okay? There are times when our northern hemisphere winters occur when we're farthest from the sun, and we're tilted away from it. So you have colder winters, warmer summers. And then there are changes in the Earth's axial tilt, okay? We're presently 23.5 degrees away from vertical, but it varies from about 22 to about 24. Okay, when all of these things combine in such a way, and those sort of have 100,000 year cycle, 40,000 year cycle, and a 20,000 year cycle. When all three of those things combine, you have very little solar radiation reaching northern latitudes in summer for extended periods of time. You get ice ages initiated, okay? And then when the reverse happens and you have a maximum amount of solar radiation in northern hemisphere summers, they all melt and we have interglacials, okay? Now, the way that these all vary is due to the other planets and our relation to them and the gravitational effects they have on them. And this is all done by computation in celestial mechanics. It's mathematics that I do not even attempt to try to understand. But it was hypothesized long ago. It's well established now as one of the main drivers of the ice ages and interglacials in between them. And that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's the main driver behind it.
All right, we have time for one final question.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, how do the paleontologists know where to look? For example, with the latest find, how did they know where on the island to look for the skull? And my second question is, do you know approximately how many years humans and mammoths were coexisting on the islands?
I'll answer the last one first, and then I'll defer that other one to the mammoth paleontologist. We don't know that they did coexist. All we know is that the radiocarbon ages of the earliest humans and the latest mammoths are getting very close to one another within our analytical uncertainties, but they are uncertainties, okay? So we do not have bona fide evidence that they were right there at the same time. I hope everyone goes away with that understanding. We don't know for sure. All we know is that it is possible. We don't know for sure. So that's part B. Part A. How do you find a mammoth skull?
Everybody here now? We look at the geology that Dan puts together, and then we go out and we scour those places that are likely to have dirt of the right age. Okay?
There you go.
And then we look in that dirt. Now, for a mammoth skull, we cheat. We have park interns go out, and then they report what they see. But no, oftentimes the paleontologist isn't the person that finds the specimen. He or she is the one that goes out and documents, excavates, and tells you what it's in and what it means. So
a lot of it is just keeping your eyes open when you're out doing other things. And in fact, this particular mammoth find was discovered by a guy named Peter Larramendy, who is an ornithologist and who was walking the canyon and saw this and said, and it went from there. So a lot of these discoveries are made by serendipity, and a combination of serendipity and people who have their eyes open and are thinking about what they're seeing. So that's the business model for mammoth hunting. So, okay,
all right,
I think we're done.